In 1873, a detailed cartographic survey of Central Asia was published in London. It showed roads, settlements, administrative boundaries, and river systems across territories labeled as Tartaria. The maps were remarkably complete. But the surveyors hadn't been there yet. The Great Trigonometrical Survey of India had reached the edges of these regions. Russian expeditions were still years from accessing many of the interior zones. Yet the maps showed features, irrigation networks, township grids, postal routes, that required ground-level observation. The scale of detail wasn't unusual for European cities. It was unusual for regions described as unmapped. And it wasn't just one map. Between 1870 and 1890, multiple European cartographic institutions published maps of the same regions. They weren't identical, but they shared something else. A level of infrastructural specificity that typically followed settlement, not preceded it. The timing creates friction. This is a documentary exploration of a cartographic pattern. It examines publicly available maps, census records, and archival surveys from the 19th century. The observations presented here are based on real historical documents. They do not claim to prove any particular narrative. They simply ask, why did certain maps appear more complete than the chronology suggests they should be? The focus is on evidence, not speculation. Maps from the 1870s and 1880s show Tartaria, a geographic label used across European and Russian sources, with surprising consistency. Not just coastlines or mountain ranges, but internal features. Roads that connected towns, administrative districts with named governors, postal stations numbered sequentially. These details require local knowledge. But the official exploration timelines don't align. The Trans-Caspian Railway wasn't completed until the 1880s. British surveyors didn't reach many interior zones until the 1890s. Russian military topographers were still mapping Turkestan through the 1870s. Yet the maps existed before the surveys. One example, an 1876 German atlas shows a network of caravan routes across the Kizilkum Desert, complete with rest stops and water sources. The cartographer cited Russian military sources. But Russian records from that period describe the region as inadequately surveyed and recommend further reconnaissance. The map showed what the sources said didn't exist yet. Another case, an 1879 British map of the region between the Caspian and Aral Seas includes township names, population estimates, and irrigation canal placements. It labels the area as part of Russian Tartary. The footnote references local administrative reports. But British access to those reports was limited. Russia restricted foreign cartographic access during this period. The intelligence network wasn't robust enough to supply this level of granularity. So where did the data come from? The map doesn't say. It simply presents the information as verified. This wasn't isolated to Central Asia. In 1874, a French cartographic survey published a map of Siberian Tartary showing the exact placement of telegraph lines, military outposts, and grain storage facilities. The map predates the completion of several telegraph extensions by 3 years. The infrastructure was drawn before it was built. Or it was copied from an earlier source. But if it was copied, that raises a different question. What earlier source contained this level of detail? The official Russian surveys of Siberia from the 1860s were incomplete. They focused on navigable rivers and resource zones, not administrative infrastructure. Yet the French map shows both. The pattern repeats. Maps that should be partial are complete. Maps that should be approximate are precise. Maps that should be delayed are early. There's a consistency in how different institutions map the same regions. The German, French, British, and Russian cartographic offices didn't collaborate directly. They competed. Yet their maps of Tartaria often align, not in artistic style but in infrastructural content. Same roads, same districts, same postal routes, as if they were all referencing a common baseline. But no such baseline appears in the archived surveys. No master map has been identified. The institutions don't cite a shared source. They cite local reports, military intelligence, administrative records. The records themselves are harder to locate. One more detail. Several of these maps include features that were later confirmed, but only decades afterward. A map from 1877 shows a bridge across a river in what's now Kazakhstan. British explorers verified the bridge in 1902. It was old when they found it, built from stone, designed to handle significant traffic. The map showed it 25 years earlier. The cartographer noted it as ancient structure still in use. Not a projection, not a proposal, a documentation. The strangeness isn't in the existence of the infrastructure. It's in the timing of the documentation. Infrastructure gets built. Roads connect towns. Bridges span rivers. But maps usually follow construction. Here they seem to arrive first. Or they seem to document systems that were already there. Systems that hadn't been officially discovered yet. The question isn't whether the infrastructure existed. The question is, how did cartographers know where it was before the surveys reached it? The maps were published. They were sold. They were used by militaries, merchants, and colonial planners. They were treated as accurate. And in many cases they were. But they shouldn't have been. The pattern becomes denser when you isolate the United States and Britain during the same period. In 1871, a survey map of the American Midwest was published showing grain silos, railway depots, and telegraph stations across regions that had been incorporated as states less than a decade earlier. The infrastructure wasn't projected. It was marked as existing. And when settlers arrived, it was there. Not under construction. Operational. The silos were stone. The depots had platforms designed for freight volumes that wouldn't be reached for another 15 years. The telegraph lines ran through territories where the population density didn't justify the expense. The infrastructure preceded the demand. This wasn't unique to the frontier. In Britain, municipal water systems were installed in cities during the 1860s and 1870s with a capacity far beyond contemporary needs. Sheffield's reservoir system, completed in 1875, could supply a population 3 times larger than the city held at the time. The engineers didn't cite future growth projections. They cited existing requirements. But the existing population didn't require that capacity. The system was over-engineered by a factor of 3. When asked, the engineering reports referenced standard specifications and recommended practice. But those standards weren't codified until later. The Institution of Civil Engineers didn't formalize water infrastructure guidelines until the 1880s. The systems were built before the standards existed. Or the standards were drawn from something already in place. The Erie Canal offers another data point. Construction began in 1817. It was completed in 1825. The scale was enormous, 363 miles, 83 locks, engineered to handle cargo volumes that wouldn't be reached until the 1840s. The canal was designed for a commercial throughput that didn't exist yet. Historians explain this as visionary planning. And perhaps it was. But the engineering precision is harder to account for. The locks were standardized. The canal width was uniform. The depth was calculated to accommodate vessels that weren't in production. The designs didn't evolve during construction. They were finalized before ground was broken, as if the specifications already existed. The same decade, Britain's railway network expanded at a pace that surprised even the investors funding it. Between 1830 and 1850, over 6,000 miles of track were laid. The network connected cities, ports, and industrial zones with a geometric efficiency that seemed planned from above. But there was no central planning authority. Each railway company operated independently. They competed for routes. They filed separate proposals. Yet the network, when viewed as a whole, formed a coherent system. The junctions aligned. The gauges, though varied, followed repeating standards. The station architecture, across different companies, shared structural similarities. Vaulted ceilings, platform widths, cargo handling areas designed for standardized freight. It looked coordinated. But the records show fragmentation. Administrative systems followed a similar pattern. In the United States, newly incorporated territories adopted governmental structures that mirrored older states almost exactly. County borders, tax districts, postal zones, all implemented within months of statehood. The systems didn't develop gradually. They appeared fully formed. Take Nebraska. Statehood in 1867. Within 2 years, it had a complete postal grid, a surveyed road network, and administrative districts with defined jurisdictions. The infrastructure matched states that had existed for 50 years. The speed wasn't unusual by the standards of the time. But it required institutional knowledge, templates, legal frameworks, bureaucratic processes that typically took decades to establish. Nebraska inherited them immediately. Britain's municipal governance saw the same compression. The Municipal Corporations Act of 1835 reorganized local governments across England. Within 5 years, over 170 towns had adopted identical administrative frameworks. Elected councils, defined wards, standardized tax collection, public health boards. The systems were complex. They required trained officials, legal documentation, and institutional continuity. Yet they were implemented almost simultaneously. The Act provided a legal framework, but it didn't provide the operational infrastructure that had to be built locally. Except it wasn't built. It was installed, as if the template was already understood. Storage infrastructure presents another anomaly. Grain silos, warehouses, and cold storage facilities were constructed across the American Midwest during the 1870s and 1880s at a scale that exceeded immediate agricultural output. Some facilities could store harvests twice the size of what local farms produced. The justification was future growth. But the designs weren't modular. They weren't expandable. They were built to final capacity from the start. In Kansas, a grain storage facility completed in 1878 had a capacity of 500,000 bushels. Local production that year was under 200,000 bushels. The facility wouldn't reach capacity until 1891. It sat 2/3 empty for 13 years. That's not inefficiency. That's precision. Telegraph networks show the same anticipatory design. In the United States, telegraph lines were strung across the Great Plains in the 1860s, connecting towns that barely existed. The infrastructure was expensive. The maintenance cost was high. The revenue didn't justify the expense for years. But the lines were built anyway. And they were built to a standard that suggested prior knowledge of where population centers would emerge. The routing wasn't experimental. It didn't follow exploratory patterns. It followed geometric efficiency, as if someone already knew where the towns would be. Britain's gas lighting systems followed a similar logic. In the 1850s and 1860s, gas mains were installed in cities with a coverage area far beyond the lit districts. The pipes ran beneath streets that had no gas lamps. They extended into residential areas with no demand. When those areas developed, the infrastructure was already there. The gas companies didn't expand incrementally. They laid full networks in advance. The investment required certainty. But the growth patterns weren't certain, unless they were. Whether this reflects inherited systems, centralized templates, or convergent development remains interpretive. But the density of these examples creates a cumulative pressure. Infrastructure that anticipates demand. Administrative systems that appear fully formed. Maps that document what hasn't been surveyed. The pattern isn't isolated. It's repeated. Across regions. Across decades. Across nations. And it's always described the same way, as progress. But the timing feels compressed. The term Tartaria appears in European maps and documents from the 13th century onward. It was a geographic label, not a unified empire but a region. A vast territory stretching across Central Asia, Siberia, and parts of Eastern Europe. The name derived from Tatar, referring to various Turkic and Mongolic peoples. By the 19th century, the label had fragmented. Russian Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary. Each referred to zones of influence, not political entities. The maps used the term because the regions lacked centralized governance that Europeans recognized. It was a placeholder. A way of marking territory that existed outside familiar systems. But the infrastructure documented within those zones didn't feel placeholder. It felt organized. In recent years, the label has been reinterpreted. Online communities have examined the same maps, the same infrastructural patterns, and asked whether Tartaria represented something more than a geographic designation. Some suggest it was a civilization, advanced, widespread, later absorbed or erased from official narratives. Others view it as a reframing of known history, a way of highlighting discontinuities in the accepted timeline. A third perspective sees it as metaphor, Tartaria, as shorthand for inherited systems whose origins remain ambiguous. None of these interpretations are proven. None are officially recognized. But each responds to the same evidence. Infrastructure that feels older, more coordinated, and more sophisticated than the timeline suggests. The first interpretation, Tartaria as a lost civilization, rests on architectural and infrastructural consistency. The suggestion is that the systems documented in 19th century maps weren't built by the nations claiming them, but inherited from an earlier, more unified society. The appeal of this view lies in the anomalies: over-engineered canals, standardized administrative districts, maps that precede surveys. The challenge lies in the absence of corroborating records. No political continuity, no linguistic unification, no centralized institutions spanning the regions labeled Tartaria. If such a civilization existed, its erasure would have required coordination across competing empires. That's possible, but the mechanism remains unspecified. The second interpretation treats Tartaria as a reframing tool. It doesn't claim a hidden empire. It suggests that conventional history compresses or misrepresents the timeline of certain developments. Perhaps the infrastructure wasn't built in the 19th century. Perhaps it was already there, maintained, adapted, repurposed by successive governments. This view accounts for the maps. If the systems predated the nations claiming them, cartographers may have documented existing infrastructure rather than projecting new construction. The difficulty here is evidence. Proving that infrastructure predates its official construction date requires archaeological validation, records of maintenance rather than origin, or structural analysis showing techniques inconsistent with the attributed period. Some of that evidence exists. Foundations beneath railways showing earlier construction layers. Stone bridges described as ancient in 19th century reports. Administrative buildings with basements larger and older than their upper floors. But it's fragmented. The third interpretation is more abstract. It treats Tartaria not as a place but as a pattern, a way of describing systems that appear coordinated without clear centralized origin. The Erie Canal, Britain's railways, the American postal grid, Siberian telegraph lines, individually, each can be explained through conventional history. Collectively, they suggest a template. Whether that template was inherited, convergent, or guided by knowledge not reflected in surviving records is the question this interpretation leaves open. It doesn't demand a lost empire. It simply asks, where did the specifications come from? Return to 1816, the year without a summer. Volcanic winter. Crop failures across Europe and North America. Famine. In response, governments expanded infrastructure. Canals, roads, grain storage, administrative reorganization. The efforts were framed as emergency measures. But the speed of implementation was extraordinary. Within a decade, systems were in place that should have taken generations. The infrastructure didn't just recover from the crisis, it exceeded pre-crisis capacity. As if the crisis provided cover for something already planned. Or as if the recovery drew on knowledge that had been waiting. This is where interpretation becomes unavoidable. You can view 1816 as a catalyst, a moment when necessity accelerated development. You can view it as a reset point, a moment when older systems were reactivated or formalized. You can view it as continuity, a moment when inherited infrastructure was adapted to new political frameworks. Each interpretation aligns with some evidence. None aligns with all of it. The maps remain. The infrastructure remains. The timing remains unresolved. The purpose of this examination isn't to prove Tartaria as civilization, conspiracy, or metaphor. It's to hold space for the questions the evidence generates. Why do maps precede surveys? Why does infrastructure precede demand? Why do systems appear standardized across regions with no formal coordination? The answers may be mundane. Shared engineering practices, colonial knowledge transfer, economic incentives driving similar solutions. But the density of the pattern creates friction. And friction invites examination. Tartaria as a label may simply be a useful frame, a way of marking the unresolved, the infrastructure that feels too early, the systems that feel too organized, the maps that feel too complete. Whether those systems were inherited, convergent, or guided by knowledge not preserved in official records is a question that remains open. The evidence exists in archives, in stone, in the geometry of rail networks and the capacity of reservoirs built for populations that hadn't arrived yet. It doesn't demand belief. It demands attention. Because even if Tartaria was only ever a geographic label, a placeholder for regions outside European control, the infrastructure within those regions tells a story of scale, timing, and coordination. A story that the official timeline struggles to contain. The maps from the 1870s feel more complete than they should be because they documented something already there. Whether that something was older than claimed, larger than recognized, or simply misunderstood, that's the question. And it remains unanswered.